question. I feel like I am getting to a point where I'm done listening to people talk about spirituality. So I'm not sure if I should just forget it. Is there any progression after I'm done listening to teachers? Well, it's a very good question. It is, of course, a little bit ironic since I'm obviously a person who's talking about spirituality and you're asking me. But nevertheless, I can recognize the feeling, because I also had a point where I felt like I was done listening, in the sense that I was done taking in. I needed to express. I needed to give out. And I think there's a very important realization on the spiritual path, is that you go through a phase where you are focused on your own growth, your personal growth. And that's when it's very helpful to listen to spiritual teachers and practice spiritual techniques. And then there can come a point where it's really the next phase for you is that instead of focusing on your own growth, you focus on helping others. And if I hadn't made that shift, I don't think I would have grown as much as I have. I mean, I know I wouldn't have. And I see this in many other people too. So I think when you are at that point, you need to find a way to basically try to help other people. But I would also say that there's another consideration that's also very valid, and that is that in the end, spiritual growth isn't driven by what you take in from the outside. The goal of spiritual growth is to raise your consciousness until you connect consciously to your higher self and to your spiritual teachers, which means who are not in embodiment. They are in the spiritual realm, but it's what I call the ascended masters. And that means that instead of listening to people outside yourself talking about spirituality, you're getting not teachings but directions directly from within. So I would say that the goal of a valid spiritual teacher is basically to take the student to a point where the student no longer needs the outer teacher, because the student can get directions from within. So you may be at that point, you may be approaching that point. And so that would mean you need to focus more on, well, there's a lot to this, because in a sense you could say you need to resolve your psychology, you need to purify your energy field of lower energies. That will give you that stronger connection. But you also need to set aside some time to listen within, instead of listening without. So I'm not sure if I should just forget it, the person says. Well, I don't think you should forget about spiritual teachings, but you should strive to listen within instead of listening to outer teachings. And then the question is there any progression after I'm done listening to teachers? Now, so take what I've said here. There's a phase where you can be helped by listening to these outer teachings. There's a phase where you need to go within, get directions from within, but you also need to give out. But are you ever really done listening to spiritual teachers? I understand where the question is coming from. I had a period where I felt I had listened to so many, I had read so many spiritual books and teachings that I needed to internalize it. And perhaps that's an important consideration, actually, because what I've seen on the many years I've been on the path is that there are some people, they go into studying spiritual teachings, and they study, and they study, and they study. And they can quote passages from this or that teaching, but they never internalize it. So, not knowing the person who was asking the question, I would say, have you really made an effort to internalize the teachings instead of just taking them in and understanding them intellectually? because that's very important to do that. Because when you internalize the teachings, you will spontaneously start having more intuitive guidance from within. But then the other thing is, are you ever really done listening to teachers because you take a valid spiritual teaching? Let's say you first find that when you're 20 years old. And the teaching really helps you. It increases your understanding. But now you're engaged in the spiritual path, you are seeking to raise your consciousness. So there comes a point where you have now raised your consciousness to a certain level. And that's what the person is describing. You feel like you're done listening to teachings. But does that mean that you have now reached some ultimate level of consciousness where you no longer need a teacher? My sense of it is that when I raise my consciousness to a higher level, I can go back to a teaching I read maybe 10 years ago, I can read it again, and now I get something out of it that I didn't get out of it the first time, because I have a broader perspective, I have a higher level of consciousness. I can see something I couldn't see back then. So it's perfectly fine to say, I feel like I need a break from listening to spiritual teachers, I need to focus within, I need to seek to help other people. But it doesn't mean that this is going to be for the rest of your life. There could very well come a point where you feel like, you just feel prompted intuitively to study out of teaching. Maybe you study a teaching you read before, and then you will get something out of it that you didn't get out of it before. I mean, I have for many years had good intuition and had a connection to the Ascended Masters. But throughout that time, I have still read outer teachings. And I have benefited from them because the outer teaching triggers an intuitive insight. So I guess what you could say here is that I have met people on the spiritual path. As I said, they study a spiritual teaching, they know it by heart, but they don't internalize it. Because for them, it's an intellectual exercise of understanding teachings. But for me, the outer teaching was never really about understanding. It was about the outer teaching triggering an intuitive insight that comes to me from my higher self and my spiritual teachers. So in that way, there is a symbiotic relationship between the outer teaching and the inner teacher. The outer teacher, or the outer teaching, helps you tune into the inner teacher, and that's the value of the outer teacher. So from that perspective, you're not really ever done, because you can still benefit. I have, over the last 20 years, I have read many books that were not really even spiritual, but we read about psychology or science or philosophy, and it gives me a lot of these intuitive insights. So, you know, I understand the feeling where you can feel like you need a break, you need a step back, but I would strongly suggest that you don't make a decision with the outer mind that I'm done with spiritual teachers. I don't need to study spiritual teaching. I don't need to listen to any teacher, because it very easily becomes used by the ego to say, oh, I have now reached some higher state where I don't need to listen to anybody. The Ascended Masters have this saying, if the guru be an ant, heed him. And it's very important to keep in mind that you never know where some impulse is going to come to you, some idea is going to come to you. Even a person who isn't spiritual is going to express something to you that you need to learn from, because it gives you, and it triggers an intuitive insight. And if you, with your outer mind, cut yourself off from this, you can really slow down your growth tremendously, even abort your growth. And I think there are certainly examples out there of people who feel that I'm awakened, I'm enlightened, and they set themselves up as spiritual teachers, they get some kind of following, and they think they never have to grow, they never have to look at their psychology because they've reached some ultimate state of consciousness. And that, of course, means only one thing. If you think that you have reached an ultimate level of consciousness, you are never going to grow beyond your present level. It just can't be done. You can only grow when you are open to growing. And let me tell you, as long as you're an embodiment on this little piece of rock, there's room for growth, guaranteed. There are higher levels of consciousness beyond what we can ever attain on earth. And I see constantly these people who are talking about this teacher and that teacher, they reach some ultimate level of consciousness. And I just look at this and shake my head and say, gosh, you have never experienced an ascended master. Because then you would know that there are levels of consciousness that is way beyond what anybody who was an embodiment on earth has ever attained and will ever attain. And I think it's very important to have that humility. Oh, you could say it's not even humility, it's just realism.